We are live streaming now. So we're still getting some. Stop sharing. We're just waiting for everyone to join us. Thanks for getting on for the second RAC meeting. And we are recording and streaming. Do you still have power on the coast?
It was flickering for a little bit, but it's on now.
Oh, good. Well,
But it is blowing. I had a meeting with some of the South Coast people this morning, and it wasn't as bad down south, but it sounds like the North Coast and the Central Coast are getting pretty hammered.
we've had a lot of rain all day in the valley, so
Is it?
very
It's
wet.
puddling, yes.
Katie, I just saw somebody try to log in on the team, so I probably at least one more person joining.
Okay, we'll give a couple more minutes. Well, it looks like we are pretty good for people joining us. Make sure you get the so thank you all for joining us for the second Ocean Shore Rule Advisory Committee meeting. I think we will, we have the agenda up here. We're going to do a recap and review. We'll do introductions just as a reminder of who's on and who's involved in the process, and then review any questions that have come up since the last meeting or anything that you wanted clarification on. And then Kevin's going to provide a little bit of background on the application process as it is current, and then some of the proposed changes, and then we'll move to a discussion on the proposed rules for the application process. And then if we need a break, we did build in some time for a break, and then would move to the emergency application process. So before we get started, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Let's just do some introductions as a reminder. I'm Katie Guthrie. I'm the Government Relations and Communications Manager for OPRD, and I'm here as a rule coordinator and to help support the experts on the Ocean Shore team. Kevin, do you want to go next?
Sure. Kevin Herkamp, I'm the Ocean Shores Program Coordinator at OPRD. I'm the one kind of spearheading of the rulemaking and then the subsequent policies, forums, and other things that will come along with the updated rules.
Great. How about Alex?
Hi, everyone. Alex Nato. I'm a real estate construction attorney. I'm here to learn and figure this stuff out.
Thanks for being on. Allison?
Hi, I'm Allison. I'm with OPRD, and I'm representing in an administrative capacity.
Andrea?
Hi, I'm Andrea Hansen. I'm the Central Operations Resource Manager for OPRD.
Diana?
Hi, I'm Diana Turner. I run a grassroots group in Cannon Beach called Friends of the Dunes, and the city is also needing to update their rules, so this is very helpful. I'm glad to be with you guys.
Nancy?
Hi, my name is Nancy Taylor. I'm the Waterway and Habitat Incentives Coordinator at Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, here to support the natural resources protection efforts related to this project.
Felicia?
Hello, Felicia Almeida-Schultz. I'm the Coastal Hazard Specialist with Oregon Sea Grant and Oregon State University Extension.
Jackie?
Hi, my name's Jackie Boyer. I work for Certerra Northwest, formerly Earth Engineers, and have worked with property owners on this permitting process pretty extensively. So here to learn and gain some clarity on the process.
John?
Sorry, hi, I'm John O'Leary. I'm a planner for Lincoln County, and I'm here to bring county permitting perspective to how this works, considering we interface on shoreline protected structure permits.
Thank you. Laurel?
Good afternoon, everybody. Laurel Hillman, Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, Ocean Shore Resource Coordinator.
Thanks, Laurel. Megan?
Hi, I'm Megan Wengrove, and this is Conley. I am an associate professor at Oregon State University in coastal engineering, and I'm in that capacity. I'm also on part-time parental leave right now, and this is one of my Conley days, so I'm going to be off camera, and I'll still be participating as much as I can.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us, and it's always fun to have little ones too. So, Nancy, you may have already. Did Nancy already introduce herself? Okay, sorry. Did I miss anybody? Okay, well then, if we move on to the recap and review, Kevin, did you have anything you wanted to share? Were there questions that came up from last time or things you want to make sure we clarify? Okay, well, if something comes up, please feel free to raise your hand. Or you can always email Kevin or I, and we can talk about it at our next meeting. I recognize there's not a lot of time between these first two meetings, but we will have some more time before the next one so that we can have a little more prep time for the next one. Kevin, do you want to start on the background for the application process?
Absolutely. And I think I was going to kind of do this maybe a little bit different than last week. Instead of kind of walking each section by each section, I have kind of some overview that I wanted to provide of the section, and then kind of each section, so we can kind of take some, I'll say, summarize some of the content, especially since this one's related to timelines. So let me share my screen here. I'm just trying it a little bit different than last week. Okay. Bear with me, I need to get another document up here. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see my screen here. And basically, this is a recap of what we were looking at last week. The under House Bill 2925, our permit timeline and application process changed significantly. And we had a 60-day process that was hard and fast. Basically, from the date of receipt of complete application, we had 60 days to make a permit decision. This really was effectively unworkable, and we had to get kind of creative to make it function, especially for bigger projects. And part of that is when you take the 30 days out of the middle for public review, it effectively gives you 15 days or up to 15 days for looking at the application, and up to 15 days making a permit decision. And that also could force our hand a little bit on having that 60-day deadline on making a permit decision one way or another, even if, let's say, there was an application that one technical issue was preventing us from issuing it. We just didn't have the time to necessarily work with an applicant or have that kind of dialogue toward the end, and it may have led to a denial. Just simply the fact that we had to make a decision statutorily within that 60 days, and there was no flexibility within that. And so we've been making that work, but it is really tough on staff and it's really tough on applicants. It's not the most workable. So when we went before the legislature, we asked if we could follow kind of a standard that I guess I'll say, for lack of better terms, that other agencies have used, and it's the 120-day process. And that really breaks it down into 3 distinct chunks of, you've got 30 days, completeness is reviewed by itself up to 30 days. Once you determine an application complete, then a 90-day clock starts that has a 30-day public review followed by 60 days for the permit decision, and then the ability to kind of extend, so that it provides a lot more function. And I'll get into that a little bit more. I have a slide that breaks this down a little bit more, but I just wanted to show that overall it's still the same steps, but we're going to have a lot more. It will take longer, but that's also going to be a benefit for us to be able to give the review the time that we need and fit it in and amongst the other applicants, because that was another thing that would happen, is if we get short on, say, a permit review and we're coming up on that kind of 15 days, and somebody has another request that comes in or wants to talk to us, we may have to just basically say, we can't even talk to you until we're done with this, because we've got a deadline coming up. And if we miss that deadline, it messes everything else up. So it really made us fairly clinical on reviewing these. Having that 30 days gives us that flexibility to be responsive for other inquiries along the way. All right, so that is the background on the change. So what does the change, kind of actually look like? Hope this is going to work. Perfect. So, and I realize there's a lot on the screen here. I'll try to kind of walk you through piece by piece, and this will also help us as a framework for the rules. So what I would ask is, as I'm kind of talking through this, if you have questions that relate or suggestions that relate to the section and rule, this would be a good opportunity for us to kind of have that clarifying discussion and kind of walk through those things as well. So basically the way the rules are laid out is we have a new step, which is the ability to have a kind of a pre-application inquiry. We currently do that as a matter of practice, but it is quite frankly, it's really confusing, especially for our staff, as we have no kind of formal way of documenting, getting the information. We'll have people to reach out and basically say, I need all of this information, but they don't even give us their address. We get their phone number and name, and it just takes so much time. And so trying to have a way that if people want to officially open up a dialogue, we have a process to officially open that dialogue before it's a full application. Otherwise, we would just be forced to, hey, the only way we can give you anything official is if you go through the full process. And that's not really fair on staff resources or the public. And so this could be things like, if somebody is buying a piece of property and wants to know whether or not what they could do, what they couldn't do, if they or if they want to pursue kind of a no state permit required review, something of that nature, where it takes a little more information, having a process set up to where they could do that. And then if it ended up that they needed a permit, the information in that would be a subset of the full application process, and it would then allow them to move into the application process. So that's kind of a new piece. So just trying to define something that we can have a little better tool to, I'll say, kind of regulate those, but also more competently track them, process them, and actually have results that are available that we can share with a subsequent landowner or these things. Because sometimes we'll have the same property, we'll get the same question 4 or 5 different times because it's been an informal dialogue, and it'll be from a new landowner or the same landowner. It just happens to be a year later and they're hoping things are different. So that's what that process is set up for. There is really not a lot of substance to that. It's just more of again a way for us to create a form and process to communicate more officially when the requests are official. Any questions on kind of that initial stage, or any feedback on what was in the rule? Okay. So then where the process is this pretty much the same, other than, again, we have a 30-day process outlined, is this completeness review. And we will have a section, it'll be one of the next couple sections we look at, but it'll be looking at what the application requirements are. And we are hoping to be much more specific on that. Our forms will be updated, so there won't really be any guessing by applicants or us having to explain things that are in rule but not on the form. We want to have it to be where the rules are written such that the forms can support them, and the forms are written such that it supports the rules and the decisions. And then eventually going to an e-permitting tool on that. So basically what that first 30 days is going to be reviewing the application to determine not just did you fill out the form, but did you actually provide the information, the attachments? Is it sufficient for us to actually do a permit review, right? So it's kind of a completeness and sufficiency. It's not a technical review from the standpoint of looking at it from like, well, I don't think this alternative is the best or that. It's more of, did you actually do an alternatives analysis? Did you actually give us the property ownership information, whatever that type of stuff looks like? During that 30 days, we would do that completeness review. If it's incomplete, we would send that back to the applicant with a notation on what is incomplete and what needs to be addressed. And then the process would start over. Any thoughts or questions on the completeness review side of things before I move on to the next step, or any of the rules that we'd published out there? Okay. So the public review, once we've determined an application complete, that is what initiates the next process. And basically, once we've deemed it complete, we would then post the site, send out the notice to the agent, to various agencies. The list is pretty much the same as we've had in the past, with some clarifications just to make it more understandable what those, especially for like notifying the other adjacent landowners and coastal landowners, looks like. And so we'll do that. We will post that, send that out. That initiates the 30-day public review period and comment period. Effectively, on that standpoint, the application is out on and awaiting those comments to be reviewed once we get to the end of that 30-day. Overlapping with that, we will start our agency technical review, which is going to be, we start looking at some of our permit decision standards, start developing maybe our initial staff findings, those type of things, looking at the application, doing any research, reaching out to other agencies with questions, that type of stuff. That all happens within that 90 days from the date that the application was deemed complete. As we move, further to the right, we get to the point where if we have had the 30-day public notice and we get request for a public hearing, or the agency, after doing like the technical review, determines that we need a public review or public hearing, it basically initiates effectively an extension of the public review process to allow a public information gathering hearing. And then once we've held that hearing, we then have 45 days following the hearing to make a decision. If that 45 days is within that 90, then we still make a decision by 90. If it extends past the 90, then we can go past the 90 on that. So that is one of those options. The staff findings piece is where we're assimilating everything that comes in from the public review process, as well as the agency technical review. And what that's going to result in is basically two tracks. One is an approval and one is a denial track. Each of those can be appealed. And so that, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but effectively, when we get to that end of the 90 days, we have to have made a permit decision. One of the new things within the rules is that we can now, under various circumstances that are in the language that I shared with you, we can negotiate with the applicant to extend that time period. And this would be something where, I'll say we could otherwise approve the project, but maybe it's something that is relatively easily resolvable, it just needs time. That would be kind of the most relevant example. It wouldn't be to allow for like a full redesign of the project because of the public comments, but it could be allowed to, hey, we got a comment about, let's just say it's a natural resource. In-water work period is a good example. It comes back, it was different than what the applicant understood, and they want to adjust their timing. That may still fit within kind of the overall findings, and it might be approval, but it might take some time to coordinate and figure out, when those dates are, can we make it happen? But again, it just, there's different options that it gives us that flexibility. As I said, currently, it wouldn't matter if those options existed. If we had to make that decision after the 60 days, we would have to deny the permit and have them reapply. So it gives us that little bit of flexibility. If we do approve the permit, then there is a 30-day permit decision appeal process that applies to both approvals and denials. But where the rules kind of how they're spelling out now is that within that 30 days, if it's appealed, then the permit can be actually stayed during the appeal process. And that is something that is currently in statute. Again, the rules don't currently really call that out. And so just trying to make that clear that, hey, before, what we kind of work right now is we say, yep, we've got your permit decision. And a lot of times people will be like, hey, I want to start work the next day. Well, if you start work and the permit is appealed, there may be damages to the ocean shore and other things. And I'll say it's not fair to the ocean shore and it's not fair to the applicant if they get into it and all of a sudden now they have to stop work because there's an appeal, or have to restore the site because they started what they thought was approved work. So we have that 30-day kind of gap between the permit decision and when the work can actually start. If it's not appealed, then their start date comes and goes and they can continue on with their project. And so it's trying to set up some some very clear expectations, so we're not creating enforcement actions or other confusion behind, yep, you got your permit, and but then a week later, 2 weeks later, we get a formal appeal, and now all of a sudden it's pulling that back and saying, well, you kind of had an approval, but you didn't. So really, everything in the gray box here is going to happen within that 120 days on most projects, unless there's an extension. And then this kind of appeal portion at the end is going to happen after that. Does that process make sense? Would anybody like to kind of talk through any of those sections, get clarity, have comments or suggestions on the rules before we move on to another section? See, Diana?
Hey, I'm wondering, when would you choose, as an agency, when would you choose to have a hearing?
So in the rule, we have a couple of things. I'm trying to find it here. So basically, what we have in here for the department, one is the department determines it's in the public interest to hold a hearing, or at the department's discretion to gather necessary information from the public that may not otherwise be available to make a decision, right? So there's kind of two pieces. One might be we're looking at the findings and going, or as we're developing the findings, there's statements, gaps, holes that we're not really confident going one way, but by going out and getting that information, reaching out and allowing that feedback could inform us more to make that decision. The other is going to be, there may be times where we're looking at this going, we could go either way, but we're not 100% sure that this is really approvable. And so let's have a hearing and let's talk through the issue that's there. Maybe there's a potential resource or some proposed mitigation that may or may not really kind of offset some of the impacts. And again, it's that we might need to have a dialogue, or we're getting a sense that there's, I'll say, something else going on out there with some of our other agencies and partners, and we want to make sure that that dialogue is happening above board and want to have that part of the public record. So those aren't really specific, but it's that we have that little bit of an out to where if we're, I guess I'll say, instead of just going on the side of approve it and ask questions later, or deny it and ask questions later, this gives us the opportunity to hold that hearing, get those questions answered ahead of time, and then make the most informed decision we can. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you. Can you also walk me through the appeal process a little more?
Yeah, we will get to the appeal process. It's in one of the later sections that outlines the appeal.
Okay, thank you.
Allison, did you have a question?
I had a question about the appeal process too, once a permit is approved. So I can wait probably for that.
Sounds good. Okay, any other thoughts on the rules or this section, the layout, anything, any concerns? Okay. With that, I'm going to propose we move on to the next section, which is about renewals. I'll give you kind of the background on this, and we can talk through kind of like we did on this one, and hopefully this format works a little better for everybody. So the renewals, amendments, and extensions is a brand new section, and I wrote in some things in the summary statement, so hopefully you all had a chance to look at that. But it is included in statute. It's also included in a rule, but the way the rule actually was written different than the statute, and there was zero substance to it. It just effectively says we can renew, extend, or modify, and it doesn't say how we do it, when we do it, why we do it. There's just nothing in the rule. And it even adds some, I'll say, confusion, because there's like a term of fail to renew or something, and it's like, well, what does that mean, right? And so there's just some language that is very unclear in the current rule. So what we try to do is go through, utilize some of the other agency programs as kind of a framework on what they do, and then make it a similar program on the ocean shore. And I recognize it's confusing. Part of why it's confusing is there is statutory language and direction to have some of these processes, but when it comes to how the ocean shore permits function in reality, some things apply more than others. And so it's kind of defining these in the right way. And so what I've put in the rule here is kind of what we've talked about internally that seems to make the most sense and line up with kind of I'll say, business practices for ocean shore projects. But I will admit, there is a little bit of confusion, and this is where having clear guidance in the forums, and that was going to help a lot on the other end. The way the rules is set up right now is really to try to clarify what that process entails. And I could see some of the language that's in these rules being moved to a guidance document later. But really the importance of having them all in this first draft is so we can all have a kind of a clear understanding of what where we're going with this, right? So renewals is probably the more confusing one, mainly because for the most part, we don't currently renew a lot of our applications in a formal sense. But in reality, things like remedial grading, some of our vegetation management projects, some of those type of smaller projects, we've taken partly because of how lax the rules are and how unclear and some of the conflicts that are out there, is we're giving the applicants kind of the benefit of the review and using that to extend and renew these simpler projects. Effectively, we use it when our determination wouldn't change, right? Is the activity you're doing is exactly the same and done in the same manner in the same place. You just happen to be asking for another year. That's where we look at using this, and that's why I have it's set up as a 1-year renewal. That gives us an opportunity to do kind of a 1-year check-in. Have you actually submitted your compliance documentation? Have you been in compliance? Are you doing what you're supposed to do? Has land ownership changed? Whatever that is, it allows us that recurring check-in. And then going up to a 5 years total. And the point behind that is it allows us the opportunity to bring any projects up to date with newer rules or policies, but not necessarily being to where we're just changing things on applicants every year because they want to do the same thing. So that's the intent behind it. I've got a note down on here. A lot of the renewals are probably going to be more relevant for general authorization type projects. And it may be part of how we tie back into this from the general authorizations is you've got one, you've been issued it for a year. When you want to renew the general authorization, this is the section we refer you back to. But it could also apply to similar types of projects that maybe don't have a general authorization, but still kind of fit that general criteria of their predictable effects and limited impacts. And so kind of looking at that as something that's going to work with the general authorizations really well, but then may apply to a broader range of projects. I don't want to limit it to just the general authorizations, especially this first time, because we may not capture all the activities under the general authorizations that eventually might need to be. So any questions on renewals? Okay. Oh, sorry, Felicia.
Yeah, and I think actually some of them maybe were answered. I tried to put some of my questions into the survey that you sent. But some of my questions were like also if for the renewal, maybe you answered that, is like I guess this also can vary from permit to permit. Like for example, if it's like a simpler recurring project, yes, but if it's more like another kind of permit, then I guess that people have to do a new application if the permit is completely different, correct? Yes. And oh, okay. And I was wondering also if it was different for like an emergency authorization. What was the case for that?
Okay, yeah, and so the point behind like renewals not really being applicable for other projects is most other projects are a one and done. So it's, I want to put in an access way, or I want to put in, shoreline erosion protection, or, even I'll say view grading. We want to grade the view. Here's our plan for this one-time grading. So it's not really something that we're renewing. It's not, hey, you can do this again, right? It was based on the site conditions, and because the site conditions change every year, you got reviewed and approved for that one project, right? And that's where the extensions and amendments kind of fit in. So that's for the bigger ones. And I would say the same thing for the emergencies. And part of that is with the emergencies, that's supposed to be a one and done. And then you're supposed to be removing it within the 6-month period. And so there's kind of that framework of, again, what are you renewing? And really the emergencies, we're setting that up as it's a temporary, it's to slow things down. It's not something that you should be renewing it and saying, well, I slowed it down this year, now I want to keep it for the next 5 years. And so it's really looking at those as kind of more of a case by case, and not just having these set up as something where we just, effectively change the extension date out a year, because that's really what these renewals is going to be. It's adding a year on, so long as you're in compliance, so long as the conditions haven't significantly changed and you're proposing to do the same thing, basically.
Okay, sounds good. And after, like you said, it's like 1 year permit that it can be renewed for a maximum of 5 times, basically. Okay. Yeah, no, thanks.
Diana? Oh, you're on mute.
If someone is asking to extend their remedial grading permit and they have not turned in the reports and the compliance isn't there, will they be denied, or will you just ask them to get that work in?
So I would say it depends. It would probably be get the work in first. I mean, even you'll see when we get to the enforcement side, we want to, as an agency, we want to resolve any enforcement non-compliance at the lowest level. So the first thing is, hey, we didn't get your pre and post photos. Do you have those? And if they send them in, it's like, great, you actually took them, you just didn't email them to them. Okay, great. Or, hey, you were supposed to do some, other work. Did you document that? Well, maybe we didn't get the report. And part of that, we're hoping that as we get the electronic permitting system in the future, some of those things will be automated reminders that we set up and kind of go from that. It's also why we have our compliance focused staff personnel, is to do more active follow-up on these permits. So it's not just getting to the very end and it's like, well, my permit expired and I didn't do anything you asked me to do except I did the work. And then we get into this issue, at the end of like, well, now where do we go, right? And so, but yeah, every situation is going to be different. I would say if they are out of compliance, the first thing we're going to be doing is trying to bring them back into compliance, educating them, and then saying, okay, we may still be extending you this year, but to some extent, we're putting you on notice. This is the stuff you need to be doing if we're going to have this relationship, because a permit relationship is built on a kind of trust and verify on both sides. It's, hey, you've asked to do something, we're expecting you to do it in that way. And if you can't do it in that way, then you might not be able to do it in the future, or you might have more, scrutiny or consequences if something doesn't happen in the future. So yeah, we always want to try to resolve things at that lowest level. Hopefully that answers your question.
Is there a fine attached to not getting your reporting in on time?
So all of those would fit under the enforcement, and there can be a fine. There can be, and we'll get to that in a few weeks when we get to emergency, but basically you can have a fine, you can have permit suspensions, ultimately revocations, civil penalties.
But in practice, do you guys find at this point, if somebody doesn't get their monitoring reports in?
Yeah, and again, we'll go over that. I don't want to get too far down that track, but
yeah,
if it's a first, kind of a first thing, no, we'll usually be having a conversation. If it's somebody who, we've now been going on and we've given, different notices of violation, we've had past enforcement actions, then it might, right? So it's every situation is unique. But again, we typically try to start with the lowest level, which is, I'm going to educate you and I'm going to inform you. And if we can gain compliance, then we're good. if that doesn't work, then we'll need to elevate and we'll need to look at things down that continuum. Again, we will go through the whole enforcement continuum in a couple of weeks, and I understand that it all paints a picture together, and I absolutely get it. So I want to try to give you snapshots as I can, so you understand the big picture.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Felicia?
Yes, sir. Another question. I was wondering, for like the permits, do they all have, I guess, depending on the permit, like different like duration for like for how long they are valid? And if there is some like renewal, even if, for example, you have differences in like how long the permit is valid, they only allowed to 1 year renewal, no matter what. So I was curious about that.
So, and again, these renewals are going to be the permits that we typically renew for, or, will issue for a year. And so this will be things, like I said, the remedial grading. We have people that'll do remedial grading 2, 3, 4 times during a year, and they'll ask for that, right? They're like, hey, we typically have to go in after each winter storm, and that's usually twice a winter, and we'll need to go in the spring, and then maybe once in early fall, whatever that looks like, right? And so typically we issue those for a year, and we say that here's what you can, what your authorization is allowing you to do. The other permits, which we'll get to in the next couple slides, are more for the one and done type of permits. And those are our permit duration is typically built upon what the applicant asks for. And so if you come in and you're like, hey, I want to do shoreline protection structure, and it's going to take me 3 months to build it, and we're going to build it from month 1 to month 3, well, we might give you till month 4, and then that's where your permit's going to expire, because that's what we reviewed it for. And then if you need to extend, and that's where the extension comes in, then we would be having that discussion. Because now if, let's just say you propose to do it in the spring, our public impacts evaluations are going to be based on spring public use, species that are present in the spring, that type of thing. And now all of a sudden you go, well, I want to now go into August. Well, now you're dealing with potentially summer crowds and, different ecological, impacts, whatever that looks like. And so we need to be able to have that kind of, hey, you've now gone beyond. So if you, and again, I'll get to that here in a little bit, but we're looking at that as extension, not as a renewal. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, with that, I'm going to move on to the extensions and amendments, just because I think it'll help clarify things, and then we can always come back to all of these. I know they all kind of work together. And one thing I would put, and if you notice in the rule, one of the statements we brought at the beginning is like shortest possible time for these projects. And really, when it comes to minimizing impacts, that is something that we've called out in the rule specifically. We've had, as was one of our current standing review criteria, is the least impact alternative possible. And we've had applicants who've come in and basically said, hey, I can do this in 2 months. We've looked at it, and 6, 9+ months later, they're still working on the beach for various reasons. And so trying to really kind of lay it out there that, when you ask us for how long you're doing something or what you're doing, that's how we're doing the review, and that's what our findings are based on, right? And so really, when you look at this framework, it's been built kind of to reinforce that information to applicants by kind of being able to be upfront with them about what they're going to be able to look at. And so as we go through this, the extension of the permit deadline, this is where extra time is actually needed. It's not intended for, well, we got our permit, we told you we're going to do it in the spring, but now we talked with our contractor, or our contractor took on some other jobs. Well, now we have to do it in July because that's when our contractor is available. Well, that could be viewed as a different project impact, as I mentioned earlier. And so part of what we need to do as an agency is to reinforce back, like I said, to the applicants, that when you ask for this time period, you need to be able to be certain that you can actually do that, because that's what our permit findings are based on. Because it's very challenging when we get an applicant who doesn't understand kind of the sausage making behind the scenes, when they come back and just say, well, my contractor says I need, another, month or 2, but then we look at our permit findings to do an extension, and it's like, well, that's not consistent with what we actually issued, and it would mean that we probably would have needed to deny the permit. Well, that puts us in a hard spot because they're calling us, a week or if a week before their permit expires, going, "You need the time, give it to me now." Well, they're already partway through their project, but yet the impacts are different, and the public wasn't aware that they were going to do this, and so it's making that balance. So trying to make these clear statements and having that set up for that extension. And so that's related to the timeline. And then the other side of that is, I'm going to go jump to this third paragraph down here, which is again another one of those for reinforcing, is the amendments of design. Sometimes you get out on the they might have applied for doing a project and they get out there and a piece of equipment isn't available, or they discover a better way to do the project. We want to be able to have the flexibility to do that when it will cause less impact to the ocean shore. But again, what we've had is applicants come in, start the work, and then all of a sudden go, "Well, you know what we proposed? We actually need to do something bigger, grander, and more impactful. Can you just let us do that?" And that again puts us into a point where we're no longer consistent with those permit findings. And so trying to again make that clear up front that we're willing to work with you, but you need to propose what you plan to do, so that we can have that evaluation, and it's going to work better for us and it's going to work better for you during your project, right? So that's what these are looking at. And so that extension of the permit deadline is you need more time. The amendment of design is something you propose just isn't working. And then the amendment of the condition is kind of on the other side of that, which is in order for us to issue the permit, we had to put a condition on it. Well, if that condition effectively kills your project, we need to have some level of negotiation. We still are going to be bound to whatever our permit findings are, but it at least starts opening that dialogue up. If they're like, "Well, we can't ever meet that condition," it could lead to a point of like, "Well, without that condition, we would actually have to deny your permit," right? So you can choose to move forward under that condition, or we can go back to our review and we might have to actually deny the permit. And so it allows, again, some level of negotiation, because there's usually some give and take there. But that's what those three kind of scenarios set up, and those are what are outlined in each of these. I know that was a lot. Let me summarize it, and then we'll come back to the technical part here. So what we're looking at for the process. So effectively, going back to that timeline I had before, we have a permit decision. We have in the past, and I don't want to say it's consistent all the time, but we have worked with applicants to review draft conditions. We'd like to have more standard conditions as part of this rulemaking that applicants can be aware of ahead of time, or at least understand the scopes of what they're going to be looking at. During that part, it can be more of an open dialogue of like, "Hey, here's the condition we're proposing to do. You have an issue with that or not?" That becomes a conversation, because that's before the permit decision. Once the decision's been made, the staff findings have been published, the applicant has the ability to appeal that decision or the condition. And so this is where, if they appeal the condition or came in and asked us during that 30-day period, again, we could have that discussion during that time period and maybe come to some sort of resolution before it went through the full appeal process. But most of this is going to apply to once the permit is valid, once it has gone into place. Effectively, what we've set up is that the applicant can request for one of these renewals, amendments, or an extension prior to the effective date of the work that's going in, or the expiration date of the permit, right? So there has to be a little bit of time for the agency to look at things. And part of that, again, is setting up those expectations up front with the applicants, because we've literally had stuff that, well, on Friday, well, my contractor's coming back on Monday and wants to do something different. Can we get authorization? It's 3:00 on a Friday afternoon. It's like that is not an expectation of success on either end, because we can't turn around a decision that long, and nor is it fair to us to have that. And so how do we set some of these timelines so that we have the ability to work with everybody? If a permit is expired, because this does happen, where it'll just get past the date when they ask. It's like, well, our permit expired on Friday, and now, you know, next week it's like, well, my contractor says I need more time. I did create a permit reinstatement process, and there are some fees associated with this. I'll say to some extent they're a processing fee, that if they get their permit reinstated, and there's some timelines in there and requirements, but basically it's to get us to look at it and get it reinitiated, and then they can request the amendment or any other, you know, request for the modifications there. So what does this look like? When we get a request, as I said, we've got 30 days to look at it. If it's an insufficient, incomplete request, we'll send it back sometime during that 30-day, and hopefully they can address that and we can get it resolved fairly quick if they just take care of those couple things that are missing. Then our decisions effectively look down to kind of approve or deny that request. We can approve if it's consistent with the original findings. If it's not consistent with the original findings, then basically we're forced into a denial of the amendment, renewal, or extension. And what does that mean? Well, if they denied, it means they just get to continue with the permit. The permit is still issued, it's still valid, right? But it has to be as previously approved. Or if they truly want to do something different and it's not consistent with those findings, then effectively they would need to reapply for the newly proposed work. So that is kind of the overview. I'd love to go back through, and if anybody wants, again, comments, concerns on any of those sections, this is pretty much all new, and would love to get feedback on how to make it better.
Any thoughts on this? We are getting the, we talked last time about how to have a document that everybody can share. I have it all in a Google Doc, and I have a Google Drive set up for Ocean Shore. So after this meeting, I'll be sending that out. It'll have the section 1 that we talked about, yes, the last time, and then the application process and this new rule, so that you can provide feedback directly on the rule language. But for today, what we are hoping to do is talk about the process that Kevin's outlined, and where there are questions or concerns, or whether this makes sense, and if things need to be changed in the rule language to make that part make more sense. Nancy, go ahead.
Sorry, there's just a lot of moving pieces and I've only got 2 screens. So when are you going to be talking about the technical elements of recognizing whether you do or do not have enough information in terms of design and geology? Is that at another meeting? Is that part of this application process, etc.?
So that will be at, I'm going to say 2 or 3 meetings from now. Because we try to kind of take it with, I'll say, some of the higher level sections. That's why we did the policy first, and then this one's more of the process, right? And just kind of it's more of the timing and timelines, those kinds of things, administrative pieces. And then in early January, we may either do, I think we had it set up for the emergency, unless we get through that today, or we could look at kind of our enforcement process, but taking some of these standalone sections so we could work through the bugs on kind of the process, give people time. And then I'm also working through our internal group to revise and kind of finalize some of the application, and I'll call it the permit review. What I'm hoping is to release both of those kind of at the same time, and giving you guys a couple weeks at least to look through those, because they will, even though we'll look at them over probably 2, maybe 3 meetings, is those 2 will work hand in hand, because the intent is to have the application requirements basically say, this is what you have to give us so that we can make the associated permit decision. And the permit decision standards, I'm basing those off of the current review standards, just compiling them in a more organized and I'll say batched, for lack of better terms, instead of being scattered throughout the rules. And so really tying some of those things back in so that if you have a standard, that says it can't affect natural resources, and one of the things to do that is how did you design the project to avoid those natural resources? Well, then the application needs to say, give us this information to show that you documented the natural resources and that you've designed it to avoid the natural resources, right? So there's those elements, and that will come later. That is where the technical piece, and that is said part of it. I want to get through these administrative pieces so then we can talk more about those. And I'm assuming that's going to take, like I said, 2, 3, if not 4, hopefully not 4 meetings, because we might run out of meetings at that point. But I want to have enough time to really go through this, and I want to make sure we've got them cleaned up and looking as good as I can. So
Great, thank you.
absolutely. Jackie?
Yeah, so I have a question about the extension definition with respect to the interpretation of unforeseeable circumstances. One of the avoidable circumstances you mentioned was contractor delays, but there are some cases where this work is prioritized to be done in the winter because that's seasonally less busy on the beach. And that's when a lot of the emergency measures need to be implemented. So if there's like limited contractors in an area, I guess I'm just looking for some clarity on what that would be, and maybe that could be included in the rules.
Yeah. No, I think that that's definitely a really good question on that. So I think what I would get behind that is we've seen on some of the projects where contractors will they'll start on a project, another permit will be issued, and they'll start working on that project. And then all of a sudden, the first one is sitting with effectively no work happening on it for weeks, months. And then the contractor will come back and then go, oh, well, now we need more time because I took on this other job or whatnot. And what we're trying to get is you need to get in there, you need to get the project done, and then yes, move on to the next one. But again, this is back to when we're sending this out and we're being advised that, hey, I've got 3 months to build this project between, I'll say March and May. And then all of a sudden, well, we got another request that is for the same contractor. And they're like, well, yeah, we'll do this in April and May. And all of a sudden now we're in May, and it's like, well, we've got multiple projects and we'd like to go out to August or July. Well, again, now we're starting to impact the public recreation. We're starting to impact other things. And what we need to do is have that conversation of these things. If you need to bring on more equipment, if you need to run, they need to get done and get done quickly. We understand things like we'll have surf events or other things that might preclude some of the work from happening. That's the type of stuff where it's like, okay, that's where you need to bring that in. But if it's, well, my contractor decided to pick up 3 more projects, and so now it's going to take them 3 times as long to do my project, that's a different situation, right? So again, it's trying to get back to, we understand the reality with the contracting, but when the applicant's asking us for that permission needs to be for what is expected to occur and actually planned and project managed to that and designed for that time period. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a helpful rule for the applicant as well, because it's frustrating when when contractors do that, extending.
Absolutely, and I want to say, I know that this may come across in some cases as being maybe a little harsh or so, but it's a situation where we get pulled between the landowners and the contractors a lot of times, and so we'll have an applicant being like, why isn't this done? And we're going, well, we authorized it for this time period. Why wasn't your contractor working on it, right? Because we're not out there inspecting it every day. And we did have a situation where we had a project that through multiple extensions went from the original, well, it went all the way up to 18 months. And it was originally less than 9 months for multiple projects in one area, but it ended up going out to 18 months. And so that's one of those things where that's not a seasonal, that's not a weather event that delayed you by a week or 2. It's literally doubling it by 9 months. And those are the things that we need to figure out how we can set our process up to accommodate those amendments and extensions when I'll say they're necessary, and we all want to see whatever's authorized get completed and get completed correctly, but not, well, we decided to do, our contractor decided to do some other things or just left us high and dry, and now all of a sudden they haven't even really started the project. Now they want another, double the amount of time on the beach. And so those are the types of things that we're looking at, right? How do we frame that up and kind of put those expectations up front? Because a lot of this is, as I said, it's causing frustration on our staff as well as the landowners, and it's it kind of, I'll say, generally comes down to project management expectations, and how do we express our management expectations and also be able to help facilitate the landowners be able to expect project management expectations, because they don't always understand those technical pieces. So how do we provide that information, and how do we set our process up to accommodate that and be consistent with the beach bill regulations?
It looks like Felicia has a thought.
Oh, I just had a question for these sections, for like renewal and amendment. Do you have, somewhere there, like the list for like, eligibility criteria and exclusion criteria? Because that may help also. Or you think it's going to be a little too really case by case, so it would be really difficult to do so. But I was wondering if that also would be helpful in terms of like clarity.
And I'm sorry, I missed the first part. I had it flipped out. Are you talking about for the amendments and modifications, not kind of having exclusion criteria? Is that what I heard?
Yeah, for like the section for like amendment and renewal. I was wondering if there was like, within that section, like some, eligibility and exclusion criteria.
So I will say I attempted to do that. I mean, I'd love to have thoughts and comments on whether or not I hit that bar, but trying to put in some of those statements, like Jackie was bringing up, like if it's not for kind of these I'll say lack of project management or something like that, right? For an extension, it's one of these things where it's like, hey, it has to be because something you weren't expecting occurred, and we're going to have this discussion. Trying to get at some of those. And so each one of those kind of has some elements. And then there's also one overall that kind of talks about what needs to be provided, when it needs to be provided. So there are some of those, but I would love to, like I said, this is new. I'm trying to process it in a way that kind of frames it out. I would say as far as eligibility, ineligibility would be more of related to the staff findings, because if you're proposing something that's inconsistent, then it would be ineligible, right? But if you're proposing something that would be consistent, then it would be eligible. And that's written in there, but it's more through that piece, because again, ultimately we're relying on that original findings. Otherwise, legally, we should be going back and doing kind of a full review of the project if it's including the public review, if it's going to be an expanded or different impact. And so that's where I would say that kind of sets the framework. So that's what I was hoping for, but I'd love to have you guys read through that. And it's a very valid point. What I don't want to do is have this lead to any confusion as we go along. We want to make sure it's ironed out. So I would really appreciate any suggestions for language, exclusions, inclusions that might make it clear or anything like that. John?
Yeah. Oh, hang on a second. My video working here. There it goes. So, and I'm sorry, I'm on the coast right now. So if this breaks up, just let me know. My internet's a little flaky right now. So when you submit so when an applicant submits their application to you, you issue that permit, and then they hire a contractor. Contractor's working for the applicant. The permit is issued to the applicant. It'd help to know the relationship between the contractor and the agency and how you regulate it, because one of the things I think you're doing is you're eliminating the need for vehicle permit or vehicle on beach permits, and you're combining their operation into the alteration permit, right? Did I track that correctly?
That is probably the best way to frame it. It's maybe a little more nuanced than that, but yes, that is because the associated construction impacts on the ocean shore are also alterations. And so yes, having those construction impacts can be part of that. And that's where I guess this is a good clarification of, I made the comment about reapplying. Well, let's say the construction methods need to substantially change. It might be that they come in for a new permit for just the construction methods, because we've already authorized the shoreline erosion protection project. If that stayed the same, but it's how to be constructed, maybe we need to review that portion again. So again, we can break those out because they are individual alterations. But what we're doing is these really are part and parcel, right? Of you're building it. It's not just all of a sudden there's a structure there. So in fact, the impacts for most of those projects, at least the present impacts, are related to the construction methods, not necessarily the structure or alteration that's being put in place. The longer term impacts are going to be from that, but the current and kind of short term impacts are really heavily on that construction side. So it is bringing that in, and we wouldn't fully do away from I'll say the vehicle access, but you're absolutely right. It'll be included more as part of this. And so again, nuances that we'll talk about definitely later, but yes.
Okay, and then
question.
And then typically the engineer, the CEG or whoever's designing the project for the applicant, my experience is they're usually, if not part of the application process for the applicant, they're practically the agent of the applicant when they submit these applications. And then I don't know how often they become maybe the oversight or the general manager for the contractor that's out in the field, because as the contractor in the field, it's actually, I mean, if you're going to describe the physical issues that happen with these projects, it's usually when the equipment's on the beach, what the operational conditions are, those types of things. And that's the general contractor that's placing the rock and doing that. So I guess that was my question is, and here's the applicant that's dealing with a contractor that, if you've ever managed a project, I think some of us have, and I think we all have some level of experience with this. It's a challenge sometimes, depending on the size of the project. These are rather extensive, projects in terms of mobilization and things like that. So I can understand how an applicant could be frustrated and would definitely try and put you in between them and the contractor in a situation. So I guess my comment or question, mostly comment, is I can understand an applicant wanting the agency involved. I can also understand the agency very much wanting to be clear about, look, this is your contractor's responsibility, but you're the applicant. You have to communicate this to them. Is that kind of how this is?
Yeah, and so we do have currently a definition which will be continuing. It's a little bit clearer, but it's called a responsible party, and that's kind of you need a permit or you're subject to enforcement as a responsible party, and that includes both the underlying landowner, but also it can include contractors and other parties who are involved in the alteration, right? And so part of what we're going to be doing in the application requirements is getting those relationships more clearly defined in our application, so that we understand. And at least in some of our guidance, and that is also, I'll say suggesting or encouraging, I'm not sure the right word is, a lot of these projects, as you said, John, are extremely complicated and really need to have a dedicated project manager / consultant of that type that's actually understands the permitting, understands the nuances between the various agencies, understands construction, and can kind of act as that I'll say advocate for the landowner. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen on all the projects. It's just, that is one thing we've seen where projects just kind of happen because the contractor is out there, and then the landowners contact us and effectively want us to be a project manager. And it's like, we can't be. We can say whether it's in compliance, we can say whether it's meeting the conditions, but we can't manage the project. And we've had basically where these landowners have gone and they've reached out to their geologist, and the geologist like, well, I look at the end. I'm not out here necessarily telling them what to do. They've talked to, another party that they may have involved, and they're like, well, I don't work on that aspect. And so they talk to the contractor. Well, contractor just says, I got a permit. I'm building this wall, but nobody's stopping and looking and saying, is this actually being built the way it was designed, until the kind of the end, and spot checks in between. And again, every project's a little different. It depends on the firms that are engaged. It depends on where we're out there, but there are some times where it's, effectively a landowner and a contractor, and they're doing, a bunch of the work, and the contractor says, well, I've only been hired to do, this portion of it. It's outside of my perspective to look at these other things. And then, and then you have the geologist has their respective portion, and you have these people. So it's looking at that bigger picture. So some of that is what we're going to be looking in the application, is better defining those roles, and also having it, the applicant explaining those things within the application, because it's, to some extent, it's going to force some of those dialogues, like your permit timing. We currently just say, when do you want to start? When do you want to end? Well, part of what we want to start asking is more of like, are you able to start and end there? And have you worked with your contractor, and do you actually know that this is going to be able to happen during that time frame? So starting to have those more proactively asked in the forms is going to also help that dialogue, right?
Thanks for that, Kevin. I think the context there makes the modification request for extensions. It makes more sense, and the context helps. You're already like drawing that, connecting the dot there, because I was just like, I know the contractor is going to influence a lot of what is or isn't necessary in modification requests or even extension requests. So it sounds like that's going to be dialed into the application phase. You're going to get that on the front end. Then that's going to be a lot clearer. That's going to help look at a request and say, yeah, this actually does make sense. Let's give them the extension. Or maybe in a situation where a contractor that's frustrating both the property owner and the agency, maybe it's a situation where we're going to encourage you to move this along a little faster because we're really not inclined to give you the extension. I suppose that's going to be very rare, but that's the point, is it does come up. So, but thanks for that. That else helps a lot. So.
Diana?
I was just wondering, have you guys considered requiring a project manager, or, that client liaison, or some role like that, to save everyone this headache, and just say, hey, if you want to do something on the ocean shore, you need an expert that is helming all aspects of this?
That is definitely, we have had that feedback in the past. I'm trying to think through. I don't think we have it as a requirement in the rules currently. It is something that I think this advisory committee could make a recommendation. I would say generally, I think it could be supported, because I think it could help the landowners quite a bit and the agency quite a bit.
Well, just everyone, right?
However, there is that financial burden and other considerations, but you're absolutely right. That is something that could be there, and that would be feedback that we'd be welcome to review if you wanted to provide that.
Okay.
Alicia?
Yeah, and I was just curious for Diana, like, was it the suggestion for another party to do this kind of work, or is it going to be like within the agency? Because otherwise I was curious if it's within the agency itself. I was curious if you had like a, project officer, or like when you have different permits, that it could be like a half time or half, like a check-in, like to have some dialogues, like, oh, as the date, it's been like 6 months in the application, they were supposed to start the construction phase, having like some times for checkup. But again, it will ask for more capacity from like OPRD, but I was wondering if that has been happening in the past, or is something that you've been considering. And sorry, also that Diana wanted to clarify if it's like a third party, or you were thinking more like someone with OPRD.
I assumed that OPRD did not have that capacity, or it would already be happening. My impression is that, OPRD is always stretched thin. I see it more as, a requirement of the application. So you have to have XYZ report, you have to have this sort of design documentation. So it's another piece that you're requiring in an application, that they have somebody who is qualified to be that liaison between the different consultants, the applicant, and OPRD. So I see it, in my fantasy, it's a standalone project manager that has some expertise to be able to be effective in that role. But I just feel like OPRD is tasked with a tremendous amount from, education through to compliance. And so, I mean, if you guys felt like you could get the money for another role, it'd probably be, nice to have that in-house. But I assumed that it was something that it could be required of an applicant. And I will just tell you, my bias is not to worry so much about the cost of it. I feel like if you're working on the ocean shore, it is going to be expensive, and either it's worth it to you as a homeowner, or it's not. But it is an expensive pursuit to be building on the ocean front, and it's in everyone's best interest if it is done in the best way possible and as smoothly as possible. And I think it is, for applicants, a super challenging process. And I imagine that, having somebody who was experienced and, and handling it would be of great value for the applicant as well.
Thank you. And just to kind of add one thing on too is, as far as the agency go, it wouldn't be something that we'd be a project manager on being part of. There's I'll say a liability plus we're being the decision maker. But part of why we have brought on the permit specialist that's dealing more on the compliance side of things is, to have some more frequent contact with the landowner, more frequent check-ins, and kind of just ensuring that these projects are being a little more managed versus issued, and then it's kind of getting to the end and it's, well, the project's done and it was done wrong, so now what do we do? Is it is it rebuild it? Is it enforcement action? Is it civil penalties? Do we live with it? What is this outcome versus it looks like you're starting to veer out a little bit, or you're starting to do something a little bit wrong, different than what you had said, whatever it is, being able to catch those more frequently. Hopefully we can start doing some of that. But that being said, we're still limited in capacity, and we have 300 miles of coast, 300 plus miles of coast that we're dealing with 3 staff members, and really 1 or 2 of those are out on the looking at projects at any given time. So it's kind of a definitely a capacity issue on that. So hopefully that helps add to that, Felicia, especially for your question. Andre, did I see that you had your hand up or had a question?
Yeah, sorry. I was just throwing out the idea, since there's been some questions on when we're going to discuss more details related to what you have on the screen, in terms of the actual permit process. So I thought in the beginning it might be great to show all the rules that are going to be reviewed from the RAC in this entire process and where we are during that day.
Okay.
For all of us to get on the same page of sort of understanding what we're reviewing, but also knowing that there's a certain date in the future where we'll review it in more detail.
Great suggestion. All right. Any other thoughts or ideas on the renewals, amendments, extensions side of things before I move on? All right. So the next section, pretty straightforward. It's basically built on current rule, is the disposition of fees. Effectively, our statute says the agency is supposed to be collecting fees to offset our basically do a cost recovery for the cost to administer the program. We will be talking about fees and the fee structure at a subsequent meeting. In fact, we'll probably be, I'm hoping, in one of the next couple to talk kind of conceptually about fees and which direction we go, because the new House bill has basically given us the ability by rule to completely redo the fee structure and move away from the percent of construction value plus a base fee kind of piece of thing, or the calculation that it is today. So, but those fees, what this section is covering is, well, once we collect those fees, where do they go, right? So they go into a dedicated account. They're used by the department for administering the program. And then we did remove, there was quite a few in a list of things that we could do in the rule, and then I kind of followed up by the any other purposes by the determined by the director. We've decided to pull most of those out and put those into internal policy, because the reality is our fees only cover the administration of the program. Well, currently don't even cover all of that. And as we move to the new structure, at least for the foreseeable future, it will be covering that program portion of the program. And then eventually, if we have additional funds and things come around, then that's where our internal policies can help dictate where those go. But yeah, just trying to clean up the rules a little bit and really reflect more of the reality of things. And then clarifying that when we talk about the fees that are going into there, it includes the fees, penalties, and other payments. So if we end up, again, the legislation clarified kind of what we can establish by rule for all these fees, penalties, and payments. And so having it just be clear that basically if the money's coming into the program, it goes into this dedicated account. And by doing that, it stays for use on the ocean shore. So that's that section. Any thoughts, questions, concerns on the disposition of fees? So, okay, appeals. So I'm going to go through, got a couple slides here that kind of talk about, sorry, I have one on the permit appeals. That this is a more text heavy portion. It's not necessarily a process. It's more of initiating it. How do we start the process? How do we do it through? So it's built a lot on our current rule language, which does have a permit appeal in it. However, there was a lot of holes. So I went and used language from Department of State Lands and others to kind of fill in the blanks with language they used. Example, when it was somebody other than the applicant appealing, we had language for adversely affected or aggrieved, but we never defined what those meant. So I've pulled in the definitions for adversely affected and aggrieved from Department of State Lands. And basically what those come down to is the adversely affected is, somebody that has a legally protected interest that would be harmed, degraded, or destroyed by the project. And then aggrieved is somebody who participated in the public portion of the process with comments and has a position on the merits, and they're basically taking the appeal based on those positions. So it's identifying those. Without that, it became really kind of a subjective discussion of, well, are you adversely affected or aggrieved, and what does that mean? So by clarifying those. Also building on the contents for the request and what that all looks like, and just having some clarifiers in that. Again, most of that was built on existing language and then augmented with Department of State Lands language. And then the process, a lot of that's very similar to what it was, with just some kind of adjustments to the organization and flow of the language, but it's the same content. And then a new section that is based on statute that was not in our rule related to the pre-hearing suspension of permits. And so being able to kind of clearly define when we can actually suspend a permit if there is an appeal. And then, so a couple other pieces that were in there, if you look through the rule, there's a couple of sections that Department of Justice is looking at, and one of those relates to discovery, and the other one relates to, I'll say, I'm putting the term in for a placeholder of cost recovery, but it's how do we, legally, there's some frameworks and sideboards on some of these things so that it's not, I guess it's not just an open-ended question of what happens, with discovery. It's clear for us and the person appealing what their what they're allowed to put in or not put in, and what those options are. So again, those are coming out, but that's our intent to have something like that in there, depending on what Department of Justice says. So any thoughts on appeals? I know that this isn't a real thought out process, but Felicia, I know you had some questions about appeals. I'd love to talk through it a little bit more here if you have questions now that we're kind of built into that. Diana? Oh, your mic's on.
I guess I just wanted to know just more about how the process occurs, who handles it, who's making the decision. Just anything that you can share about how that happens.
So and I'll say there is some part that's outside of our agency. So basically what happens is they submit the appeal to our agency, and then we work with our director's office and Department of Justice to kind of, I'll say, make sure we've got the information there, and then it moves on through the Office of Administrative Hearings, and they have a whole set of rules that let's set that aside and what that process looks like. Basically, at that point in time, we will get a ruling from the administrative law judge, and then the director can finalize that as a kind of a final order or final matter. But the other part is the agency can also negotiate kind of outside of that appeals process as well. So if somebody comes in with an appeal and we look at it and go, well, you have something reasonable there. It was a good point. Maybe we can work with you. Would you be interested in this as a resolution, and to kind of negotiate that out? That is also an option. But when it goes through the actual contested case process, then that is handled outside the agency with the Department of Administrative Hearings. There we go.
And can you talk about the timeline for
Well, yeah. So as an agency, we have 30 days to refer things over and kind of figure that part out. Once it's there, it can take a long time. We're currently in one situation now, and I'm going to say it's going to be 9 months to a year probably before it's fully resolved. If it could be longer, just kind of going, I don't remember exactly when all the appeal came in and everything, but just kind of through memory going, I think we're approaching the 6 to 9 month mark at least when this will be resolved. So it can take a while. And again, that is all through the Department of Administrative Hearings, though. It's outside of us, and it's based on like any court case, what is, or court proceeding. If they need to have multiple days of testimony, if there needs to be different fact finding and evidence gathering, and presentation. So it's I would say not everything, or not every contested case is going to be equal, because some may be a matter of one fact, some may have multiple facts, multiple laws that are being questioned, and again, it's just going to make it that much more complicated. I know that was not a direct answer, Diana, but I don't have anything better. I don't know if Katie or Andrea, if you guys want to provide any additional background, or if you think that covered it.
I don't have anything to add, Kevin.
Yeah, I would say you covered it. So much of it is outside of our control or purview. So we can put the processes in, but the timing doesn't always, we don't always have the control of that piece.
Yeah, basically we control the request portion of it, and then the process is outside of our control, and then we control I guess I'll say the final decision, codifying the final decision. I guess maybe it's not the right term to use, but the kind of the director has the responsibility, once they get the report back from the administrative law judge, to then create that final order. So, and then there is also any of our decisions can also be appealed through the Court of Appeals as well. And that's for once it's gone through the contested case. So there is to add more confusion to it, there is always that other level that as with any sort of court action, you can always take it to the next level.
And how often do you guys have something go to appeal? I mean, in a year, just, I know that's hard to say, but.
Well, I'll just say generally we've had very few we've had 2 this last year. So, yeah, and it really depends, I guess. It depends on what the requests are that come in and what our permit decisions are. And then also on the applicant too. Because I mean, an applicant could choose to appeal, or they can choose to basically resolve the issues and reapply. Because our decisions are with or without prejudice. So if we came out and said, portion 1, 2, and 6 of your proposal are not consistent with the ocean shore regulations, and you went, okay, I see where you're coming from. Well, I can address and I can submit a new application and address 1, 2, and 6. Then that might be your choice, is just to resubmit and bring that back in. And so, which could be cheaper and more timely than going through an appeals process where you may or may not be successful. And that's the kind of the good thing about us when we do a permit findings at the end, is we're telling you where it's not qualifying and why it's not qualifying, right? So if you're able to address that, then you can always address that and resubmit and try again.
And do you know how often you guys, the ruling is supportive of OPRD's decision?
I don't think we have enough data on that to even comment. I mean, we've had very few appeals. There have been things over time, and again, it depends on the case. And I'll say that's one thing that we're hoping also with the part of why I've been making a big push to have the rules updated, is by as we get to the permit decision criteria being more subjective and the application criteria to be more clear and tied to that, then as we're making decisions, we're doing it objectively, looking at those standards as much as we can, versus, I'll say, potentially in some cases it might be like, well, I can read that standard one way or the other, and I could see it applying exactly the same way to this project. And that's just because there's some subjectivity to that review standard. So hopefully this will help us in the long run be able to more clearly identify those, but also be able to be more upfront with applicants, so that it's like, if you don't do this, then you're probably not going to get a permit. And that's one of the issues we've had too. And that's where a lot of our permit denials have come in. And we've actually told the applicant effectively, here's a standard you have to meet. And then they put in a proposal and they don't meet that standard. And it's like, well, that's a denial. And so again, how can we be clear up front and help applicants understand what that process is?
Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead, Felicia.
Yeah, and I guess following up on that, again, it might be a little tough to know based on the past permits, but I was curious, what were some of the main causes of, decline of permits? And after, if you been identifying like some kind of pattern in like some of the point of contention that people have been appealing. And I know, for example, we had more of the text for more like the emergency authorizations, so it's something I was looking more, in the text of that. And I can see sometimes it can be a lot of, at least for me, confusion in terms of like the timeline. Are you within still a certain time for your authorization? And but I was curious overall for like permit, if when permits were declined, what was the main cause usually?
So as far as our denials go, typically, I will say it ties back mostly to project need and alternatives.
Okay.
And again, this is where I'm putting a lot of work. It's one of the areas I keep reworking, which is why I'm not ready to share the application requirements, and that is trying to refine it so it's clear for us and clear for the applicants. And there's no perfect way to do it, but we do see a lot of projects that are, I'll say, landowner desires or contractor inspired projects, those type of things where there maybe isn't currently a need. And once they've got the, well, I want to do a project, then a lot of times it's, well, I only want rock. So they work with a consultant, they get a proposal, they get an application together for rock, but really they never went back to, is there actually a need to do this? And how do I design my project to be the least impact and that make sure it's the least impact alternative? Because rightfully so, and again, I'll even blame this a little bit on our rules and past practices because of how our rules are, is while that's in there, it's hard to have that discussion with an applicant. And so when an applicant hires a professional and says, all I want is rock, and that's, my neighbor has it, I want it, well, then it becomes very difficult for us because that really wasn't an alternatives analysis. You came in and said, I wanted this thing, and I wanted it because I had a little erosion last year. When you look at it and go, well, your house is still 150 feet from the ocean and you lost 2 feet of bluff. And now you want to go to the most extreme event, right? And I know, and I'm using this as a kind of a excessive example, but there is no need, right? And so that's one of the situations that we see quite often, is there's just that lack of real defined current need. It's more of a want or a desire, and then the alternatives really going through and actually designing to be the least impact for the ocean shore. It's typically designed for the most benefit for the upland landowner. And so it's kind of how do we balance that out? So I would say that's generally where it's at. And then the second part to that is either not working with our staff or not listening to our staff. Because when we'll have these, like as I mentioned earlier, we'll have some of these discussions with an applicant and be like, well, here's the rule and here's what the process, to have the kind of most likelihood of success. And, again, landowner may not have the technical skills to understand all that. And then they're like, well, here's my application. And then we end up having to deny it because we've had this discussion with them, and that's ultimately why it ends up getting denied. So, but usually it's the need and alternatives that within that. So.
No, thanks. That's helpful, because I was asking that in order to, figure out even in the rulemaking, like maybe what are some sections that need to be, emphasized, or clarification on the language or requirements or things like that. But apparently have been applicants have been putting that aside, maybe not thinking it was one of the main criteria or something to consider heavily that can lead to a permit, being declined. So I was just curious about that. And after also and that leads to the permit appeal, because if people but after, if you have let's say a paper trail and you say, hey, we've been communicating with you, that was the requirement, you didn't meet the requirement, then there are no excuses. But I was really curious about what the pattern was related to that.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I'll point out too, which in this, Diana, goes back to a comment you had about having a consultant, and having seen on the other side with Department of State Lands when I was over there, but kind of something that's different with their permitting is there's a large pool of natural resource consultants that get involved, as well as engineers and geologists and other people that work on the removal fill type projects, which is effectively alterations in wetlands and waterways, so versus alterations on the ocean shore. And we don't necessarily have the same consultants working on the coast. And I think that's one of the issues that we see, Felicia, kind of to get to your point, which is project design, project management is complicated, and the regulations are complicated. And again, kind of going back to what Diana said, this is where I think in some cases, I think you're onto something where a consultant could be a big benefit to a landowner, so that you have an expert, on your side. But as I said before, they're really, other than some of the geologists that are working out there, there's not a large number of consultants that are currently working on the ocean shore. And so there is a potential capacity issue, I guess. But go ahead, Diana.
Well, I would say it's, it's markets at work. So traditionally, riprap has been fairly easily approved. There are a lot of people who, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but there are enough organizations that can provide that service. As soon as these applications become denied more frequently, and there is pressure to do a thorough nature-based analysis. And there is an understanding that those are the only options, then there will be people, you know, when the market, when there's that need, then people who have been, you know, only doing riprap will extend themselves into those areas. And there will also be, you know, coastal engineers who can get work in Oregon. And so, you know, it's circular, it's connected. There's not enough of a market for it. There hasn't been enough of a demand. And then also in the document that you shared with us last time, the 94 recommendations, there was reference to doing some additional certification for geotechs and that ilk. And I think that's an incredible recommendation. I hope it comes to fruition. And I think that there could be something, you know, ancillary and sort of like, you know, the project management realm as well. And, you know, Kevin and I were up in Washington with a Washington Sea Grant Ocean Shore Planner Group seminar on cobble berms in September, and I was talking to planners up in Washington, and they said that, you know, all of this has really happened in Washington in the last 5 years, has it? But 10 years before that. So Oregon is behind, but not, I mean, we can draft off of these experiences in Washington where, you know, the state rules changed and the marketplace changed and the consultants and expertise changed. So I'm hopeful. I think that it can happen. And I know that there, you know, I'm sure Megan has students who will be graduating soon with their masters and could, you know, take on those project management roles and there are other places where really qualified people could be helpful to this process. That's my little cheerleading for for this process to get better for everyone.
Thank you. Megan?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I appreciate what Diana said, and I think you all know I'm definitely an advocate for nature-based options. I wouldn't want the rules to go to that's the only, and I think Kevin, you know this, that that's the only option, because I think there's still a spectrum of different projects and different project needs, and like we can advocate for more investigation into nature-based solutions, and maybe that's the first like approach that we'd prefer or the state would prefer, but in some cases that just might not be feasible. Conley's here making his comments too. Yeah.
All right, thank you. All right, Diana, did you have another comment? Okay.
I just wanted to say real quick, I agree with Megan. I'm not trying to suggest that there's never a time for hard armoring. I don't pretend to have the expertise to make that kind of you know, statement, and that's certainly not a position that my group has. But we know that we have the people who know how to do that. I just am seeing that there is, and we've talked about this, I know you mentioned it last time, Megan, we don't have the people readily available to do some of the more coastal engineering and the nature-based solutions. So, and even if it were a riprap project, I'm sure that process would be helped too by having an on-site project manager. My background is in film production, and I know that having a producer there, you're going to get a better result and a cheaper result. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. But I just wanted to make sure I was not saying never hard armoring or anything like that. So thanks.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking you were Diana. I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page. And I think I'm not trying to put Jackie on the spot, but I guess I am. Jackie, you're representing like the geo or the Centera geotechnical side, and I'm curious from your perspective how much training or how much you feel like the field of engineers who are responding to these projects actually have, or how much you would want to have different training, or like, yeah, I'm very curious about that.
Are you asking like experience and training for nature-based approaches, or what is
I guess
specific?
nature-based and just working on the coast in general. I'm curious yeah, I mean, you're one data point. I recognize that, but if you have any
Yeah.
thoughts.
I mean, we have a lot of experience on the coast. We do a lot of geologic hazard assessments uh, for private and public entities, and our experience for shoreline protection has been pretty extensive over the last couple of years. I would say, from our perspective, we kind of get involved once the project is at a point of needing an engineer, because we have geotechnical engineers as well as certified engineering geologists that can design these. So yeah, I think for nature-based approaches, we would typically hand that off to a group that specializes in that, because it's kind of, once it gets escalated to a certain point, that's when we get involved. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so what I've heard from, and this is just, yeah, what I've heard. So I don't live on the coast, and I've interacted with some different groups. But what I've heard is most of the time there's groups that say, oh, well, this is your only option, like riprap is your only option, and we can design it for you. And they actually don't even know that these nature-based approaches are possibilities, and also don't have. I mean, there aren't any coastal engineering firms in Oregon, so I'm not sure who are, unless they're contacting like the outside companies like Integral or Natural Systems Design or Blue Coast out of state. I don't know who they are. Is designing nature-based approaches for them?
In the past, when we've suggested them, it's been handed off to like a geologist, or coordinating with a landscape architect. Yeah, from our perspective, it's just not our expertise, and we've gotten really familiar with the different nature-based approaches based on our avoidance analyses that we go through with these applications. And so we have an understanding of them, and I think with, like, as we've gotten more involved in these, then we could potentially design these, but at this point we just haven't. We've had like initial visual reconnaissance with the owner and present them their options, and then proceed with our recommendation, whether that's getting involved or not.
Okay. Well, maybe we can chat a little bit more. I'm sure Kevin has other things on the agenda.
I was appreciating the conversation, and I think we will have more dialogue on this when we get to the application and permit review. As part of, I guess the sneak peek is one of the things, and Jackie, I appreciate you saying it, where you've got the geologist and the engineers working together. I've actually had landowners who say we're working with our engineer, and it turns out they've only got an engineering geologist, and their understanding is that there's actually, I'll say that that they're working with an actual engineer, not and I'm not saying that to like say engineering geologists or anything, but there's the difference between those two practices. And how do we define that better to make sure that we have the professionals who understand the geology and the professionals who understand the design and some of those, and have those two married appropriately for the project designs? Because we have things like we're supposed to be signing off in our staff findings on safety. And I'm not a licensed engineer, but having a licensed engineer actually being able to put their professional engineering stamp on that means a lot more related to safety than the agency saying, well, yeah, it looks like it was built good, that type of thing. And so making sure we have those things appropriately outlined, I guess that's where I'll put it. And so, and having having the experts involved and the right experts involved at the right times. Jackie, did you have something else?
Yeah, I guess I don't know if this is the right time for it, but in the shoreline protection structure application, it specifies geologic reports by a certified engineering geologist. So maybe that could be a consideration if you are hoping these projects have more engineering analyses, then it might be expanding that requirement.
Absolutely. And definitely clarifying it, because right now it's one half of a sentence in one small paragraph, and actually defining some of those things and actually having geo report requirements and based on DLCDs, shoreline erosion, or not shoreline, coastal hazards, guidance, and some of those things. So anyways, that is jumping ahead. So I think with that, Katie, go ahead.
Great.
Take it over.
So we've completed the first section on the application process for the rules, and on our agenda we have a break. We're a little behind, but let's still take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and talk about the emergency application process, and go through what the proposed rules there will look like. I did put into our file sharing the link to the Google Drive, so that it has all of the rules there, and it's in the RAC 2 file folder in the file sharing document. So I will see everyone back here at 3 o'clock. Thank you so much. Okay. It's not quite 3 o'clock. Do you want to switch, Kevin, to the emergency? I guess it's one more screen. We'll give people another minute. I think we're not quite 3 o'clock yet. Okay. Well, thanks for hanging in there with us. I know these are long meetings and there's a lot of content. So we're going to keep working on format to make them as useful and engaging as possible. But we'll start with Kevin talking about the emergency permits.
Yeah, thanks. So I sent the summary statement over, so hopefully you guys have had a chance to look at that one as well. The big thing about the emergency was, I'll just say, as with a lot of our rules, the current statute, and I mentioned this previously, was kind of really focused on shoreline protective structures and didn't necessarily look at some of the other things that may be happening out there more as we look at sea level rise and just erosion in general and further development of the coast and access, those type of things. So, and it had some problematic language within it. And so we went to the legislature last year and requested some changes be made, and it put a lot of the emphasis on the rulemaking for the department to define these terms. And so this gave us that legislative change as well as the ability to go through the rulemaking. Is a lot of that was set upon the 1994 recommendations. And so specifically issue 8 within those, and I did copy those into that summary sheet. So I recommend that you take a look at those if you haven't, because what you'll notice is a lot of the framework in the rules supports a lot of those recommendations. And as we talked about previously, while these recommendations were from 1994, the policy and the dynamics within the state really haven't changed that much since then, especially since our rules haven't changed. And so most of them are just as valid today as they were back then. But the other thing that I wanted to kind of give you was, why do we need to look at these emergency rules and some of the problems that we currently have? Because I think it's important for you as an advisory committee to kind of understand what we're dealing with. And while emergencies sound like this great thing, hey, let's go out there, let's help somebody out when they're in the time of need, let's respond to this event, that's not the reality. The reality is we get about one request a year. And at least in the last 3 years, they've been, well, I should say we've only had one a year. We've had it's been limited to very few applicants, some of them repeat applicants. It's also been used kind of as well, if I get you to declare emergency, then when I come in to do the full process, I've already justified my need, right? And so it kind of is not necessarily been utilized the way maybe it was originally intended. And but we do have situations like it happened in 2018, 2019, and other years in the past where we have groups of emergency come in, and it is related to a large storm tide event that causes significant erosion, or we have different debris, whatever get washed up on the ocean shores, things of that nature. And so the problems we've been having, and this is, I'm going to say kind of a conglomeration of Tyler and I's observations over the last 3.5 years, is the criteria we currently have are really unclear. And so it really makes it difficult when we're having the discussion again with the landowner, who's in many cases, it may be kind of an elevated, stressful situation of, well, I've seen some bank erosion, or I've been told I need to do this. What do we need to do? And there's a lot of interpretation that goes into that, and so that hasn't been real good. The other one is we see especially the recurring requests have been, well, oh, king tides are scheduled for November, so we need to do something. Well, we don't. There's no threat right now, and you did this last year. Why didn't you resolve the issue between then and now? You haven't even moved the needle. So there's been those kinds of well, if I just come in and get an emergency, that's a way to bypass it and I get what I want without having to go through the full process, without having the bigger fees. And quite frankly, it takes a lot of staff time to baby some of those requests through when maybe they're not truly an emergency. And as I noted, it's the way we've been doing the criteria that aren't consistent with the past recommendations. And it's also led to a lot of inconsistencies over time in application of the emergencies. The application process that's out there it's currently, there's really limited information, and the way it's set up, I would contend that if we followed the current rule to the letter of the law, we couldn't actually issue an emergency permit, because there are some coordination requirements that it's like, well, you can't make a decision until this has happened, but you're supposed to be making a decision timely, which would be before this could happen. So how does that actually occur, right? And so there's just things like that conflict, and that process is really messed up. And even things like there's an emphasis on verbal authorizations that have to be converted to writing within 5 days. And so it's one of these things where you have these conflicts because that's dependent upon getting information from the applicant to do a written permit. But what we're finding is that, if we say yes, that's the last time we hear of them until we're telling them that they're out of compliance. And so it's kind of this problem. So there's no process. Getting the information from the applicant can be really tough because it's not clear what's required. And even though we've created some website guidance, it's very difficult to get applicants to give us that information. But yet, because our rules aren't clear, it's hard to hold them completely accountable and say, well, we're not going to move this forward until you actually get this to me. And so it's been this kind of delay and frustration on both sides of the coin. And so and that lends itself also to kind of the fees, bonds, and insurance, which we'll talk about when we get to full permits as well. But we've had these issued free in the past, and after having dialogue with our council, we're supposed to be charging fees for any of our permit decisions, including the emergencies. And then also bonds and insurance are some of the other things that we should be, but we don't have specific language in the rules on why we get the bonds, how much the bonds are, how we utilize them, that type of stuff. And so having a little more clarity in the rule on that's going to help out. And as I alluded to a little earlier, the applicant permit fee follow through is probably one of the biggest challenges. Is it just, and I'll say the emergency situation happens, we got to deal with them now. They want us to have an answer to them yesterday. And then as soon as they've got the yes, we don't hear anything back. And then it becomes a compliance issue. And I would say pretty much all of our emergency permits have resulted in a non-compliance unpermitted fill, whether it's they put in materials that weren't what was authorized or the way they did it, or they left them in too long. It's just not working. And part of that is a result of, in the past, our guidance conflicted with our rule, which conflicted with statute. And there was kind of this understanding of, well, if I put emergency in, then I get to convert it to a full permit. Well, that led to the understanding of, well, if you tell me yes, then this is a way to bypass the permit process. And that was part of what the 94 recommendations were getting at, which is these are temporary fills. These are placement of materials. It culminated with a project a couple years ago that basically built a revetment before or as part of the emergency, and then came back in and said, well, now I just want my full permit for a revetment. Well, that bypassed the entire alternatives analysis. And effectively, we were stuck with a project as is, or basically making them remove remove that and completely start over. I mean, and so again, that's not the way the process is set up. And so this kind of lack of guidance within the existing rules really has led to this wide range of ideas and problems that result from that. And so it's really tying things back to, if we do an emergency decision, it needs to be there to pause, and reduce the erosion in order for that more permanent solution to be looked at and actually evaluated, right? That's the intent. And then this last one, I kind of mentioned this, but it's this, we've issued a few verbal and a few written. Every one of the verbal ones we've issued has come back to bite us, because the applicant has an idea of what they want to do and that they presented to us over the phone. We said, yep. Well, then when they talk to their contractor has a different idea. And ultimately the applicant goes, well, I got what I wanted. And then when we go out and look at it, it's like, well, that's not what you asked for. And that leads us into a big problem. And so we need to have a way of kind of making sure that we're all communicating correctly, and that we have, as staff, also understand what the minimum we need to document things from our end, because what we don't want to do is create a compliance issue by trying to do the nice thing and say yes over the phone, and then it turns into a problem for the landowner later on and for us as an agency. And then the other part is, as I mentioned, it's kind of this continual requests and, well, I got an emergency last year, so I don't have to go through the full process. Just let me keep doing this, because every year it's a new emergency because we're going into the winter again. And that's kind of been a piece that's not consistent with management of the ocean shore. It's not consistent with our best use of our staff time. And it's just really become almost somewhat of a game. And so just trying to lay these out so that everybody has a equal playing field, including the agency and the ocean shore, but that the landowners still have that option. So that's really, when you see what I kind of have framed up, these are the problems that I'm looking at, also trying to move past, because I think we need a program that works for the landowners, it works for the agency, and it works for the ocean shore. And if it doesn't work for one of those, then it's not really working for it shouldn't work for any of us, I guess, is where I'm going. And so how do we get that? Right now, it's so heavily on the applicant side of things, and it's not working for the applicant because it's too far that way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of show you, I've got another graphic here that I'm just going to show, kind of trying to represent what the process is, and we can walk through more of the rules, but I wasn't necessarily planning going section by section through them, and more of having this broader dialogue and then seeing what your thoughts were throughout this. This is a new format, as I said, so I'm open to any ideas, comments. But internally, as we started having this discussion, we kind of, when we were initially writing the rules, it was trying to treat an emergency as an emergency. And what we kind of came to the conclusion of is you really have kind of three different scenarios that come out of this, right? You have this episodic event, something happens, it causes a problem. That is broader this time, and there's definitions that I've included in the document. But basically looking at it as, this is a definable one-time event that happened. It's not chronic erosion that's been, chewing back at your bank for the last 20 years, and all of a sudden now you're going, well, I should probably do something. It's an emergency. It's hey, an event happened and now something is there. But what is that from an event, right? So we have, out of the three pieces, I'm going to start on the right and move to the left, just because the left is where most of the bulk of the requests come in currently, but that's because of how our rules are currently written. Is we have situations where marine debris washes up, or where we may have an access way that's covered with wood or sand or something of that nature, or eroded out for that matter because of a storm event. They could also be something that damages some level of habitat, or blocks something that again, it's in management of the ocean shore, it's a natural process, but it's something that without intervention will lead to a degradation of the public interest. And so I've called that kind of an emergency restoration, for lack of better terms, but really it's looking at, hey, if there's something we need to react to, we should be reacting to it. And so this will also apply to things like marine salvage when a ship washes up, or an oil spill. If there has to be sizable alterations involved with it, right? It will hopefully we'll have a general authorization that will cover some of these things and kind of the small routine stuff. But this will allow us the ability to respond to these. And I think I brought it up at the last meeting, like, heaven forbid we ever have a new Carissa type event come up again. Well, there was a lot of alteration involved in that. I think we could all agree that the alterations out there to get that off the ocean shore and deal with it before it became a hazard is worth dealing with right now versus looking at it and going, well, in a couple of years, once you've put together your application and all your required documentation, we'll look at this, and the boat's going to sit there. So it's how do we respond to that and legally be able to do that. So that's kind of what that's covered up. And really, when you look at this process, it's set up as, when does that event happen? And then by day 60, you should be applying. If the event has kind of ended, if it's ongoing, basically you have up until day 120 to apply. And that's to get things going. And part of the reason behind that is having that 120 days is plenty of time to let the conditions become safe, but they still may not be. It's safe to work on the beach, but maybe not safe for the upland structure or other threatened structure there. And so being able to have that little bit of time, but it's also not going out to where we've had some things where, well, last November I had erosion happen. Well, now it's November of the next year and I'm going to have it again next week. So I need an emergency. And it's like, well, but it's been a whole year and you haven't even talked to us, right? And how do we limit some of that? Again, there has to be accountability as well on both sides. And so where do you draw the line? 120 days should get us past most of the aggressive oceans, or at least provide some windows for some emergency temporary work to happen. The second pot is, it's a carve out that's currently in statute that we don't cover a lot in our, really at all in our current rules, which is for repairs of anything that was built prior to the beach bill. It's kind of a grandfathering, or things that were previously authorized. What the statute basically says is that we can waive the public review process for repairs. We don't waive the permit process and permit standards. And so building that into the emergency will allow for us to be able to, again, respond to somebody when they come in and say, wow, we just had a storm event and I lost a chunk of my revetment. I want to put it right back. Great. We'll also have general authorizations that will be allowed for repair of those as well. But it's this will, again, give us that ability to react when something's failing. And it has less stringent standards to it than if it is a unprotected area, because you've already gone through that process and you're looking at putting it back the way it was, or keeping it intact when it's starting to fail, that type of thing. And then so does everybody kind of, those first two buckets make sense? Okay, not seeing any questions. So the third one, which is, like I said, probably where most people are going to interact with this, is going to be when there's private or public threatened upland infrastructure. And we have defined that. And really it's coming back, part of why we're trying to define that infrastructure a lot clearer is, once again, it's very vague in our current rules. And there's been interpretations that it was related to property lines. Well, property lines run onto the beach. So does that actually mean, if that was the interpretation, that you could do rock out at the ordinary high tide line halfway out on the beach? That's not, that was not the agency's determination of, what that intent was. And we've also had, requests for ancillary, hey, my sidewalk something's happening to my sidewalk. Well, those things, again, if you go back to the basic removal fill alteration standards of hazard avoidance is a lot of those things, landscaping features, can be relocated. They can be, so we tie it back to that actual infrastructure, and that primarily is for dwellings, and then like roads, sewers, some of those types of things that that really are existing infrastructure. Same processes. As long as there's an continuing imminent threat, we can go up to that day 120. A couple things that we added in related to this is that if you get past the 6-month mark, if you unless there's a distinct new event, you can't request another emergency. And so that was I kind of mentioned earlier, where we've had people come in and there's been one, and now they're a year later saying, well, I had an event a year ago, now I should get an emergency. It just puts that accountability part in. And so that's where that came in. And then the kind of final big piece is that we have the catch-all for at 180 days from the day we've authorized it, or within 180 days from the day we've authorized it, is all materials need to be off the ocean shore and restored. I noticed somebody did call out May 1st. That is a remnant. In reality, that will be probably a date that is still used on most of the applications, but I wanted to make sure the rules could go past that for those situations where we needed to. But typically by May 1st, our hazards have, hazardous conditions have subsided, and it's getting material off the beach will be prior to the main recreational season. And so, but there are some cases where we may have, limitations on construction on the beach if it's plover habitat or some of those things. And so having a little bit more flexibility. So that is something that was a remnant. I had it hard and fast in the rule at May 1st, but we changed it to 180 days so that we could at least have a little bit more flexibility. But again, when we condition the permits, most of our standard conditions is probably going to be May 1st. So that hopefully helps outline what is spread out through those multiple pages. It is definitely a new framework, and like I said, I'd love to get your feedback on kind of how this fits in. Hopefully you guys had a chance to take a look at it. I'm going to open it up for comments, questions on each of the sections. I just want to. Nancy, go ahead.
Again, I hope I'm providing comments in the appropriate timing. So you had imminent on your diagram to the left, and I like your definition of imminent on page 1, representing one of our key staff members, Scott Marion. He's wondering, it says here, imminent only applies when based on quantifiable data. If there's no before photos, or someone hasn't been asked to stake and measure prior, how will you guys determine whether it's actually long-term accumulated erosive situations versus one that just became imminent recently?
So, I mean, and that's a really good question, and I would love thoughts on where that is. So Dagami does have long-term data available, and I'll say generally speaking between us and our beach rangers. So we when it comes to an emergency, we are pretty much usually lockstep with our beach rangers, who for the most part know every square inch of their beaches. They're out there, on some of those sections daily, some of them weekly, some of them, a little bit less frequently, but they're able to communicate that type of stuff as well. But as far as the landowner, I guess what we're trying to get at with that is there needs to be, going to go back to the broader term, that justification of need, right? Is being able to show that this is actually something that's happening, and it's not just, I'll say, the speculative or that larger kind of, well, I think something's going to happen because we're coming into the winter, or I lost 2 feet of my bank even though I have 150 feet left. Those type of things. And so how is it that we look at those, whatever is available, make that decision? So it needs to be based on some level of information that we can actually chew on, I guess. And this edit was based on some comments that John Allen with the GAMI had made, and so it may not capture exactly how he had wanted to frame it, but it was trying to get more at that intent of what's going to happen, where are we at, what's the likelihood of what's going to happen, because part of that can be some of our areas of coastline may have, you know, tens of feet in an event potential, where others may have inches that are typically, you know, expected during any major event. And so looking at those different sites, and so some of this will be working with the GAMI for us to have better data at our fingertips as well. And so that's where you know, we will be looking at on our side. So I don't know if that fully answered it, but I'd love to have ideas and that kind of feedback, because you're absolutely right. I don't want to get into a position where we're going, well, there's really nothing here, so you don't qualify, or it's, yeah, it looks like it is, so go ahead and we'll say yes. Again, I want to make sure we're being realistic, so we don't have unachievable criteria. So I'd love to get feedback, because this is probably about the 10th definition of imminent I've written in the last couple months. So it is not an easy one, and I'd love to get everybody's input on all of these definitions and the criteria in this, because this is not going to be a perfect thing. And what we did talk with the GAMI previously was also looking at, like, how do we eventually maybe get some of that quantifiable data to where it's more in, you know, in more of a hands-on, so we can even have things, I'll say, if it was at an ideal condition where we know those observed and expected erosion rates and the maximum erosion rates in certain areas, maybe by littoral cell or even, you know, sub area beach level, that we can then have published and available, you know, to our staff and to the public. So hopefully we can get there someday in the future, but that's the ideal piece. But how do we start moving toward that direction, right? So we're all working off the same sheet of music and treating each stretch of coast the way it should be treated.
And just quickly, since I have the stage, do you guys have any definition anywhere of nature-based?
So I believe I started one, but I need to work with DLCD to better frame that. I have a draft. It's in, and we have that's in the, I think that's in the application requirements, I believe. And so we haven't got to that as our internal review yet to fully look at that. And so I will be working with Rhiannon on some of that too, but we don't yet. But I think I'll say generally, we're looking at something that kind of, where nature-based would be something that works kind of with the form, function, and ecology of the shoreline. And then you could have, I'll say, structural and non-structural components of those, where, again, that's going to tie into the goal 18 side of it. So you'd kind of have non-structural nature-based and structural nature-based, but both of them would be setting up to kind of work with and not against the general ecology and geology and use of the ocean shore. So that's kind of, I'll say, an initial piece. So I'd love any thoughts you have on that. If you want to send me any ideas or considerations, could definitely take that into place as we refine that.
Okay. And one more just for now. On page 2, line 34, you talk about temporary erosion measures should provide a reasonable degree of increased safety while preserving and protecting scenic. And one of the comments again from Scott is, a lot of the emergency structures are piled riprap. You know, how is it consistent to have piled riprap, and how is that, you know, protecting scenic? He just felt like there was definitely some inconsistencies there.
Okay, and that's on, sorry, I know which one you were talking about.
It's page 2, line 36, 34.
36, there we go. So I'll say the intent behind that, that's a really good question. The intent behind that is to, I'll say, dovetail with our overarching ocean shore review criteria. Kind of, I'll call it, it's alteration project light review of, but you're absolutely right there. I see there could be some conflict with, if you just pile riprap. Now if it's piling riprap between two existing revetments, that may be acceptable. Whereas, like I said, if it's something in a brand new area that's pristine, maybe it's not compatible. Yeah, I would love to have any thoughts on kind of how to clean that, because like I said, that is based on the standard review criteria. But if we need to kind of massage that so it's a little less restrictive, I think that could be something that could be worked into there.
And one more thing here, page 3, line 13, where you are prioritizing and listing out various options such as dumping riprap, placing biodegradable or eco-friendly sandbags, or then you say the construction designed revetments. One of the comments is that last one, which is they're basically eyes, 1 eye, 2 eye, 3 eyes. That third one we're suggesting shouldn't actually be there. It should be more of a description of what you want.
Okay, you're absolutely right. I see what you're saying with that, because it's saying what you can do and then that's falling out. Yeah, I gotcha.
Yeah.
Because that's what isn't allowed, and those all came out of the 94 recommendations. But I see what you're saying as far as the organization. It doesn't fit that organization.
Yeah. And then the other element is, do you want priority between 1 and 2? If it's temporary, do we care?
I guess I go back to it. It needs to be appropriate, right? I mean, that's the piece, is like, if you're able to do hardened structures on your property, it needs to be an appropriate design and what's available. And there are some places on our coast that don't have readily accessible rock all the time. And so being able to use, the appropriate measure is I think I would necessarily have them as a priority, but I do think it's, especially since it's temporary, because I think we have the overarching criteria of it has to be removable and restorable within, the 6 months.
Yeah, and then the last one we had was basically, we're just wondering, page 4, line 16, how does lack of planning invalidate, valid emergency permit request process?
Okay, sorry, what was, I missed
So
the
it's
line.
page 4, line 16, and you're talking about lack of planning is not sufficient grounds to warrant an emergency authorization, which we completely support.
And I would say to some extent, that portion I could see it actually going more into some of the guidance, but I think the intent behind that, and I'm just going to use some examples here, is we've had individuals who've reached out to us for 3 years talking about they want to do some sort of shoreline erosion protection. And then we get to year 4 or whatever, and they're like, oh gosh, now it's an emergency. And it's like, well, you had a lot of alternatives and a lot of options when you started talking to us 3 years ago, but you literally have done nothing. And now you're coming in and saying, agency, drop everything because I decided not to do anything. That was kind of the intent behind that based on that feedback. How do you quantify that? That's a good question. Again, I would love to have some thoughts on how to massage that. Because like I said, the intent, it's not I would say that the intent is more for that proactive, or where, we've reached out or we know there's some sort of dialogue or it's very obvious. It's not, the intent is not to be where it's so crucial, like, well, you should have known, right? Or that it's, because we have land ownership changing. We have things where, people are only there once a year and when they come back and all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, things have changed. So that I don't necessarily see that as lack of planning, but it's especially these more overt where we're literally having people who are just punting and punting and punting, and then until such time as it actually becomes a problem, and then it's again, agency, you need to do everything for us because we didn't do anything, and that just again it makes things untenable from everybody, because we had time to negotiate, we had time to discuss, we had time to plan, and that just went away. So but yeah, I'd love to have some thoughts on that.
And then is there going to be
do you have any recommendations on that? Just curious.
I don't. And again, I'm basically forwarding Scott Marion's comments, and if you want, I can forward them to you. The very last one is there going to be any more discussion about compensatory mitigation stuff?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, and I guess I'll say not necessarily within the emergency, but when we get the mitigation is going to be tied into the application requirements and the review standards. And so basically what I've done, again, kind of peeling back the curtains, is I'm using the standard mitigation sequencing. And so it's, again, our ocean shore rules are built and statutes are built on the first step, which is the avoid. And so it's really trying to build on the avoid. And then for unavoidable, how do you minimize? And then for what you can't minimize, how do you mitigate? And, thinking there's going to be some active mitigation, whether that's, I'll say, actually planting a revetment and making sure it's vegetated to decrease some of the visual impacts where it's needed, or if it's, well, there really isn't many other options, maybe it's, leans more towards an actual compensatory mitigation. Same thing with like fill on the beach. That, again, that can be a compensatory side of things, but really trying to use that mitigation sequencing. What the actual mitigation looks like, because that could be a RAC in and of itself, I am leaving it more open at this point in time to, I'll say, build on what is currently in rule, which is that the applicant is supposed to propose mitigation. We may have some guidance on what that looks like, but until we have an actual work group that really sits and goes through mitigation and looks at some of it more detail, and I'll say, to where we could have something more similar to like a, what the Corps, DSL, or some of the other agencies use, where it's a very defined and objective mitigation process for impacts. Can we, are we able to come up with something like that? And that's going to be another question. But at least for now, I want to make sure that mitigation is just something that's called out. It's something that's expected if you can't further reduce impacts. And again, it's technically current in the current rule. It's just hidden. It's buried.
It
And
looks like John has a comment.
Yeah, go ahead, John. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say that at least with lack of maintenance of their existing revetment, I mean, I think one of the things that could demonstrate that is notice. And I wouldn't bind yourself to that. I wouldn't say if we didn't send you notice, it doesn't mean you weren't maintaining your structure. But I'd say if, because your ranges are pretty, I mean, they're pretty observant. They tend to notice when things are falling apart. If you send them letters saying, hey, your revetment's falling apart, you need to deal with this. I think the letter right there is documentation that, hey, as the owner, you were put on notice. We're not going to let you submit an emergency, application in the last minute. I don't know when you decide to exert that or don't, but I think putting that language in a notice probably would motivate, I don't know, maybe it would motivate somebody to not submit an emergency permit, maybe get, be a little bit more proactive. And then the other thing is like trying to determine imminent threat. I have no real good suggestions for that, but just from experience, if it's something subjective, maybe subjective, I like the survey says answer. So if you can find 2 or 3 different opinions either within the agency or between another agency like the GAMI, if some if more than one person takes a look at something and says, that looks like an imminent failure, that seems solid. It seems like a pretty defendable position in determining what is or isn't imminent, especially if they do it independently of each other. But those are just my thoughts.
And I appreciate that. And one thing I forgot to point out when we were talking about the imminent is when you get down into the eligibility criteria, like starting at number 3 on page 3 of 8, and into the exclusions, so 3 and 4, part of that also helps, I'll say, try to make that imminency a little more objective beyond the definition. And so there are some kind of pieces in there that I think also pull that together. And part of why the definition, we can't have it be regulatory in nature, it has to be descriptive. And so having that eligibility and exclusions will help kind of define that. And so that's where some of those things like the 120 days, right? It's like, and it's expected to happen. It's either happening or it's expected to happen based on, or continue to happen, I should say, over the next 60 days. So it's kind of one of these things of trying to tie some more of those criteria in to better refine that. So just want to make sure that you guys knew that those two kind of work together. Okay, let's see, Felicia.
Yeah, and actually adding to that, is what I was thinking too, because I saw, your definition of imminent threat, but after looking through exclusion, there is, like on page 4, line 15, when it mentions that one of the exclusion is like that situation resulted from seasonal, predictable, routine, or long-term chronic erosion. And I was thinking that that piece, seasonal, predictable, routine, or long-term chronic erosion, might be also good to be a little better defined, especially for people who are not like new coastal residents who have no idea that this is, something that is seasonal, that is something that, even what erosion is. So I was wondering if that could be added, and then it will help to make the difference between what is imminent and what is basically, chronic. And then, that is you need to get prepared for those because these are chronic. It's like part of the current situation. It's not really a surprise, Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Diana?
Hi, I think I'm adding to what we just heard, but the based on quantifiable data, that really jumped out at me too, for me as well. And I think anything you can do to explain what that is or what you guys will be leaning on would be really helpful. And then I like what you have for imminent. It means a threat isn't a present or worsening condition. I think that's strong. I think we understand present and getting worse, but then, like you just touched on, when you get into expected to occur in a short amount of time, that expression, a short amount of time. I mean, these are the sorts of things that we've spent hours debating in local hearings. This is what I mean by that squishy language. So I think it would be really great if you could, put that 60 days or whatever is appropriate there. And then just down below on 8, where you say actual threat to, again, that's another one where it's like, it needs to be defined. Like, because there are people who feel like because they live on the ocean shore, there's always a threat. They should, of course they need something always. So again, and I know I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, you're having those conversations, but then you get into what's a threat, So I think anything you can do to put, your definitions to be strong with here is how we're going to be looking at this, and here is a timeline. That's really helpful to decision makers and then applicants as well. That's all.
Okay, and I guess, and one thing I'll just reiterate too is as you guys are looking through this and providing your comments on that Google document, I mean, not just calling out, but if you have any thoughts or ideas of how to reorganize, connect, or other language to use, absolutely, please throw it in there. We're stronger as a team to kind of understand this. I think you can get where I'm coming from on the language, and I would love to have some extra eyes and brains giving some ideas. Okay. Any other thoughts on emergency? I know we're kind of coming to the end of our time here, so I want to make sure we get any of your thoughts before I turn it over to Katie. John?
Yeah, just one other thought. If so, emergency permits potentially are going to be extended beyond 1 year. It might, I would recommend that, I mean, I assume there's going to be they're going to have to submit a form or a letter or something to the agency in writing requesting that extension. You might want to ask them to get a Lux as part of that extension from the local agency, because in the case of some permits, if we issue them, like a floodplain permit is, if it's temporary, it's temporary, but depending on how the regulations are written in each jurisdiction, 1 year might be the maximum length for that temporary permit. They may have to go through a permanent or some other permit process with that agency before submitting. So just
and that is something to clarify. We require the land use coordination. The one thing that's probably a little different is the way the rules are written now is kind of some of the permits. Our emergency permits would be provisional, and effectively we would still reach out, we would notify, we would do some level of coordination, but especially if it was like let's say it's a Friday night emergency and we say, okay, we'll just say, we know from the map you're Goal 18 eligible, you can just, but if on Monday you call the county and the county says you need these permits and you couldn't do what you did, then we're going to be asking you to take it out. So it's on you as a landowner to understand that this is provisional. And if you place this, you may be taking it out next week. So I just wanted to let you know that, because that is a little bit of a change. But part of that was because, as I said before, it was a conflict of that coordination of how do you do an emergency if you have to do all the coordination and a house is falling in the ocean, right? It's that kind of that piece. So
and I think most of us feel comfortable with that, Kevin. I was thinking it's more like 150% type thing, I think.
and then just to address the other thing, we would not be extending these past a year. These would be the 180-day. It's temporary and removed, and then you would be applying for a full permit. So they would have that opportunity there. Megan, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was wondering, the emergency permits are the only situations where there's been goal exceptions. Is that true? Did you say that?
No, so typically the goal exceptions would apply to full alteration, shoreline protection, but they also apply in these emergencies. And really the easiest way to kind of frame this is under the ocean shore, avoidance is the kind of measure we look at, avoidance and minimization, right? But because we can't issue contrary to land use planning, we're going to be looking at the goal, I'll say the eligibility just from a simplistic term. So if your property is Goal 18 eligible, you're going to have other options that can be considered, but all properties need to be looking at the non-structural nature-based first, and then going to the harder. So it's kind of that continuum I showed last week where, really everybody's eligible for the stuff that's softer and greener. Goal 18, you have the ability to go above that, but you are still supposed to start over in the softer and greener. And that's the language we're trying to clarify, is that you can't, Goal 18 doesn't mean you just get rock. And that's been some of the interpretation in the past. So if you're looking at an exception, if you have an exception, then you could look at those harder pieces. If you don't have an exception, you're not going to go through the exception process in time to get an emergency. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Hopefully that's a long answer, but hopefully that clarified it.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks.
Felicia?
Yeah, so my question was, if it's, let's say, 1 year enough to go through two application process, because let's say you apply for like an emergency authorization and then you realize you want to do then the application for like a long-term protection structure. So is 1 year realistic in terms of time frame to to go through the two processes?
So
did it even
yeah.
happen before? I was just curious if there is any precedent.
Yeah, and I think we have seen applicants do that. And I guess I'll say some of it comes down to the motivation of the applicant, and some of it comes down to the capacity of the consultants. What it and this is a very broad generalization, but it seems like once a lot of emergency work happens, the applicant kind of goes, "Oh, I'm good. I can breathe now." And then they're now really pushing the contracting work or the consulting work until we're basically approaching them saying, "Hey, it's time to remove this. It's time to look at that." And they're like, "Well, what am I supposed to do next year?" And it's like, "Well, this has been here for 6 months. You had 6 months to figure that out." And again, that gets back to this, there has to be some ownership. And that's why we need, with having these, we can communicate some of that stuff more clearly to the applicants of, here's what's going to happen if you start this process. Here's what you're looking to do if you want to do something additional, right? And so, but to answer your question, I guess the framework has always been for an emergency, kind of like if you didn't have enough time to go through the application process. Well, we now have the 120-day process. I do understand there's project design and those type of things that come into that and background, but trying to tie things back to that, like there actually is time to go through a process. Now, is there enough time to do design and other things? Maybe not. But again, how far do you draw that out? Where do you draw those lines? I'd love to have feedback from this group on that. But that's kind of was starting point was with some of those. You see the 120 days. Well, that lines up with our 120-day application process, and having 180 days to keep things in, that builds in another few months for doing some of the other work ahead of time. So there's kind of these couple of things that are going on within that. And then we did have the ability for I would say the one thing we did put in for that scenario is there is kind of an extension process. If you have a complete application submitted and you're going through the process and you don't have your full permit yet, there is an opportunity for us to look at that, right? And so it's, again, if somebody's going through the process, doing the right thing, then we can work with you. I'll say it's the other side of things where it's just material on the ocean shore because it was put on the ocean shore and then the landowner's not following through. That's where we need to just draw that line. So
yeah, no, that makes sense. And I'm just thinking that then maybe also having a guidance document that explain, and I know it might be difficult because each permit is different, but like how long it takes for people to have an idea. Project design will take about this time. Construction phase will happen around this time, knowing that during the summertime, that'd be really difficult to do, because of impact, to do your project. So all those considerations that are laid out. So it means like you need to think about that, really early on, as soon, basically, almost at the same time as you're doing your emergency authorization. You should think about them at the same time. So I think that may help. But yeah, no, I was just curious about that. Yeah.
Okay, well, it looks like we are just about at time, and we've gone through both of those things. So we will take the feedback from today and put in the drive, the Google Drive document, and in the file sharing, there is a link to that. I did fix the link originally. You shouldn't need to ask permission now, so you can click that link and then get to the 3 sets of rules that we've talked about so far. We'll keep adding to that. And at the next meeting, we'll take some time to really go through the comments that are submitted there and kind of the general direction and put some more context about where pieces of this go and kind of more context around the direction for the rest of the future meetings. So we will get the agenda and the materials out with plenty of time to review before the next meeting. But I hope that you all have very happy holidays and a safe and happy new year. And Kevin, did you have anything else before we wrap up?
I just wanted to ask what you guys thought about the flow today. Did having kind of these overarching, kind of statements for each section as we went through it, did that make more sense to go through it that way? Or would you rather go more to kind of what we did last time where I gave an overview at the beginning and then we walked through each section by section? To kind of see if anybody had any opposition to this format.
Oh, I thought it was easier to read the summaries because sometimes when you just read the language uh, of a section, it doesn't necessarily jump out at you how it might be different or what's better or what's worse from existing language. But in your summary, you pointed out what exactly is going to be going on when you read the legislative language. I found it to be a little clearer.
Great. So you like this format better, is what you're saying?
Yeah, at least
Okay.
if we're going through the rules section by section, I do like it a little better. I think it might be nice if it included some things like, this section had material on mitigation, but mitigation isn't really a defined topic, and it's also a big one, and how OPRD is going to fit into the sort of mitigation machine that operates in Oregon isn't really clear. And so mentioning that, you're working on something, or that definitions are yet to come, or coordination with DSL is happening but not yet, or just a little bit of context, I think would help a
Okay.
bit.
Okay.
Okay, we'll continue to provide feedback. It's an ongoing process, so we very much appreciate all of your time and dedication to making these rules the best we can do that. So thank you all, and we will see you in the new year.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.